On today's podcast, we sit down with Warner Bailey, founder of the influential platform Assistants versus Agents. Warner got his start as an assistant at William Morris Endeavor, but turned the frustrations and challenges of entry-level life into a movement, bringing transparency and community to the entertainment industry. We dive deep into the shifting value of the assistant track, why 62% of assistants thinking starting at the bottom means less today, and how economic imbalances in major cities might be shutting talent out of the business altogether. Warner shares the unexpected story behind his viral platform, the industry's reaction to greater transparency, the impact of Gen Z, remote work, and the future of assistants in an AI-driven world. If you're looking to break into music or entertainment, or just want to know how the ground floor of the music industry is evolving, you won't want to miss this conversation. Insiders, are you ready?
Welcome to MUBUTV's Music Business Insider Podcast, where our mission is to educate, empower, and engage artists and music business professionals who are dedicated to having a successful career in the new music industry. Here are your hosts, Rich Ezra and Eric Knight. Welcome back, Insiders, to another episode of the MUBUTV Music Business Insider Podcast, where our mission is to educate, empower, and engage your music career. On today's episode, we're thrilled to welcome Warner Bailey, founder of Assistants versus Agents, a platform that has rapidly become the authentic voice for the next generation of music and entertainment professionals. If you've ever wondered what it really means to start your career as an assistant in today's industry, or question whether the old school pathway still makes sense in a changing landscape, then this episode is for you. We dive into the realities facing assistants in the music business, from pay transparency to the rising cost of living in major cities, to the way remote work, Gen Z attitudes, and even AI are reshaping the workplace. Warner shares insightful data from industry surveys, what companies can learn from the platform he's built, and the incredible power of community and conversation to drive change from the ground up. Plus, Warner opens up about the personal experiences that led him to shine a light on this often silenced corner of the business, and reveals why growing your network and human connection matter now more than ever. You don't want to miss this deep dive into the future of breaking into the music and entertainment business. But first, a word from our sponsor.
Hey, Insiders! Are you an aspiring musician, artist, band, or future music business professional looking to take your career to the next level? Well, look no further. At MUBUTV, we offer personalized career counseling and coaching designed specifically for folks like you.
Imagine having both of us by your side, guiding you through every step of your music journey. Our sessions are tailored to meet your unique needs, focusing on critical aspects of your music career, such as refining your songs, defining your artist story, identifying your target audience, and enhancing your social media presence, just to name a few.
Whether you're just starting out or looking to elevate your existing career, we've got you covered. Our comprehensive approach ensures you get insights on everything from live shows to branding and marketing strategies. We understand that every artist is unique. That's why our coaching is personalized just for you.
And here's the best part. We offer flexible coaching packages that fit any budget. Choose from individual sessions ranging from 30 to 90 minutes, or save with our discounted 4-session packages. Experience custom sessions designed to enhance your music career, with opportunities for greater savings when you choose bundled sessions. Investing in your musical journey has never been more accessible.
Imagine the clarity and direction you'll gain after just one session. The feedback on your songs, the strategies to grow your audience, and the confidence to perform live, all tailored just for you.
So why wait? Don't let uncertainty hold you back. Join us for your free 15-minute discovery call at book.mubutv.com for a transformative coaching experience that will elevate your music career. That's book.mubutv.com.
Hi, this is Lisa Ferris of Soundtrack.io, and you're listening to the MUBUTV Music Business Insider Podcast.
Welcome back, Insiders. Today's featured guest is Warner Bailey, founder of Assistants versus Agents, a platform that has rapidly become the authentic voice for the next generation of music and entertainment professionals. We got him based on an article.
Right.
I read about his platform. I read something about it.
Right.
And I thought this would be a really interesting, because what I was reading was the kinds of things that he talked about, the shifting landscape, the values that are changing. And, those kinds of things are always very, very interesting to me, because you can't see, it's like like what he reveals, you can't see where things are going unless you know where
you've
things
been down
have
the
been.
path.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what it gave me. It gave me a real understanding of someone who's not only been there and done that, but who actually sees where things are going. And there was some real great insight in here. I thought the whole, assistance track value proposition, which is what everybody sort of firmly believes in, like the only way to get ahead is to start as an assistant. And he placed a lot of doubt on that. He talked about some of the surveys that he had done where that's being questioned. So it's really an interesting kind of thing. Like, where else do you get your experience? Well, in terms of placing the value on that, he talked about some of the other alternative ways. So a lot of really interesting points that I thought were talked about.
It's another area, Rich, that's ripe for disruption, as we've been talking about in a lot of our episodes recently. So this is another area where I believe that it's falls into that area. I really liked what he talked about alternative entry points, which you kind of touched on. Due to the shifts in the industry, especially after COVID, people can now launch their own projects or brands straight out of college, offering new ways to get into music and entertainment beyond the traditional male to exec route. And so this is exactly what we're talking about, disruption, and how that's even playing into this world today.
Yeah, very much so. And it goes in line with, when you talk about that word disruption, a while back we had a guest, Benji Stein, who also talked about, the disruption of old traditional models and how, his whole invention was totally disrupting that industry.
Correct. And with that, insiders, sit back, relax, and enjoy our featured conversation with Warner Bailey.
Warner, welcome.
It's good to be here. Appreciate you having me.
Thank you for joining us. Ever since we discovered what you were doing with, assistants versus agents, we've wanted to have you on the show. And, we had reached out before and there was a family emergency. And I'm so glad that you're able to join us today. I want to start this conversation by looking at the inspiration behind it. I guess the question is, was there a particular moment or personal experience that made you realize this was a conversation that needed to happen in a more public forum?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And again, appreciate you having me on. I started the account assistants versus agents while I was at WME. I was an assistant in 2018. Surprising to many, I actually really loved and valued my time at WME. I eventually got into Live Nation, working in more of the festival space. But I had the opportunity to work for great bosses. I was actually only assistant for about a year. So it's funny that my name is so tied now to the world of assistants. But, me and my peers dealt with many of the same frustrations that, all of us had, and certainly prior generations of assistants felt as well. But in terms of your question, I don't think there was a single moment that sparked it. It was more of I would say slow evolution, of it. The account started as a creative outlet. It started as a meme account. It had about 50 followers that were all at WME. I think it allowed me to use humor, and my creative side to reflect, I guess, the shared realities of working in entertainment. It was a way of feeling honest and, but never personal. So I think it was and even is a bit therapeutic for me. And I get notes saying it is for many. So, but over time that changed, certainly. There's a level of deep engagement. I've received thousands of messages, emails, DM, LinkedIn messages that I guess it's developed into this, platform that is, a lot of trust from the following. So, I think that it was a slow evolution, certainly from the beginning.
Warner, thank you so much for joining us on the show. We're really glad to finally have you on there. I wanted to ask you, your survey had found that 62% of assistants believe that starting as an assistant is less valuable than a decade ago. If that's so, how do we then distinguish between valuable learning experiences and outright exploitation in the assistant track?
Yeah, it's again, great question there. We did a survey last summer that asked our following in our network a bunch of different questions. One of them being the one you highlighted: 62% of assistants believe that starting out as an assistant now is less valuable. And so I wouldn't say necessarily the assistant model is no longer I guess outlived its usefulness or however we would say it. But I truthfully believe it's no longer the only path to success. For my own journey, starting out as an assistant at WME was foundational. I had no ties to LA. I'm from the East Coast, from Philly, went to school in DC. I had no ties to the entertainment industry in general. So that role, it gave me access, it gave me structure, it gave me a network of peers that I still lean on today. But that was 10 years ago. I think, with COVID, the landscape has certainly shifted, especially post-pandemic. So I think, now it's easier than ever to launch your own company or projects outside of what we call like the traditional model. I've seen kids coming out of college launching their personal brands through newsletters and social series. And as I said earlier, like launching their own company. So, I think there's more access points for people to enter our industry now. I think it's a much longer process if you're going strict through the mailroom. I do think the industry rewards those who put in their time and effort. Reputations can kind of bound to that, but it's no longer a one size fits all pipeline like it was in the past.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, the thing is, I think what intrigued me about it is, I've been in the music business for 47 years. I came from that old model world and, into the new model. And what is so interesting about what you've done in terms of the platform is that you've created a platform to me that gives voice to an often silenced group. And I guess my question is, have you faced any kind of resistance within the industry with agents or executives or institutions that see this kind of transparency or whatever as a threat to the status quo? Because there's so much documentation that you've talked about with regards to abuse of,
this happened by accident, certainly, in terms of the growth of the account and the voice it's created. I also came up through the traditional model and value it, immensely, like I just said, and have great relations with my bosses and my ex-bosses and still do I run a company now that does a ton of work, with these organizations. But I will say the first couple of years, like I was totally anonymous behind the account. And I think there was not a lot of, pushback because I think the account never called out people by name. Really brought up more general talking points and gave people the platform and the voice, and also this feeling of I'm not alone in this, in this line of work and the things I'm dealing with. So the first couple of years, it was fully anonymous. When it became known that I was behind the account through a couple articles and the trades, I was nervous because I think, I had a business at that point that was, the music festival world and brand partnerships and working with these companies. But in the past 2 years, it's been really interesting to see the total flip. I write a newsletter now. I've interviewed and, top execs at WME and Spotify, the NFL, UTA, Wasserman, like all these traditional places, Disney, Spotify, and now like have done brand partnerships with like Paramount, Amazon, Netflix, like all the companies that I was nervous to see how they would react, because I think they see the platform that's been created as the authentic voice of the next generation. And so they're investing in partnering, with me to reach that next generation, see it as, of execs and see it as a pathway towards entering the cultural zeitgeist in their mind, or like, showing a public sense of like, we hear you and we want to, potentially make changes. But that was never my goal starting the account. And I still struggle with it from time to time because people really look at me towards like, how are you going to approach this subject? And like, I don't always want to, get involved in some of these things, but I think because of the platform, it's creative, I've allowed others to voice their opinions through different avenues. Like the newsletter I write and the interview series that I have launched. So I've allowed others to take the stand on things that are important to them and use it more versus having to get involved myself and everything.
Yeah. And that's what I think is so significant about what you have done, is that you have opened up the possibility, like so many other aspects within the music business or in the overall entertainment business, you've opened up the possibility of discussion and conversation around topics that we never really discussed before, certainly not in that kind of open way. And that's what I think is so significant. And you've just, voiced that about how, even staying behind the scenes, that conversation and the kind of response you were getting from the clients that you're dealing with now as the authentic, platform for that, which I think is what change is really all about. When people are, it's like things were a certain way until they weren't, and there's so many aspects in entertainment that we can point to like that. But it's these kinds of things, I think, that all contribute to the conversation shifting.
Yeah. And, I was talking yesterday to, one of the top comms people at a big agency. I won't list them, but, we're trying to invest in, a panel series at HBCUs and underserved, communities to give more access to people trying to break into our world. So there, I think there's a shifting voice, not only in wanting to be a part of the platform or, aligned with it, but also true investment from these large legacy companies who are actually, doing things behind the scenes and I'm working with them to, I think give more access, give more resources to their own employees and others looking to break in, which is great to see. And again, that was never the goal of mine, but now given that I have, this platform, how can I leverage it for good? And other companies are, really have a lot of respect for a lot of these, larger companies who are reaching out and finding ways to get involved and do good within, within their own, I guess, companies and outside.
Yeah, it's really, really great. Warner, have you found that the experiences of assistants differ across agencies, studios, and production companies? Or are there certain sectors that are more progressive?
That's an interesting question. I don't know if because I've only really been on, I've never worked at a studio label or a production company, and I can only speak from my experience. But, I think that many would agree that the most structured assistant experience still remains at these agencies. There's nuances to each company and sector, but I do think one thing is true, though. We are seeing more and more smaller companies, smaller studios, everything you listed, smaller labels and production companies pop up, launched by younger and younger execs. So I think there's certainly a shift in the assistance of, the experiences of assistants depending on, size of company, how long that company's been around. I think these younger companies started by, call it Gen Z execs, under 30, certainly differ in the way that assistants are given autonomy, a seat at the table, and assistants that, previously wouldn't even have a seat at the table are creating their own table and creating their own company. So I think agencies still certainly have the most structured experience for assistants, but things are changing rapidly. And the definition of, what is a studio or what is a label, because so many of these companies that are popping up now cross those boundaries of what we would traditionally define as one of those sectors or, labels around a company.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I wanted to ask you one of the things that I thought was so interesting in doing the research on this particular interview was you had spoken about the fact that, the average assistant salary is about at $45,000. And yet many are expected to live in high cost cities like LA or New York City. And I guess the question I had is this kind of economic imbalance impacting the talent pipeline? Are we losing potential industry, future industry leaders who simply can't afford to even get their foot in the door?
Yeah, that was pretty fascinating. Last summer, I just, thought it would be interesting to put out a poll asking a couple questions around, the salaries of certain individuals. And it was an effort with Amplify Her Voice, who they're doing some amazing things around access for, females in our industry. And I would answer your question with absolutely. We received thousands of responses to the survey. We call it our pay transparency survey, which we released earlier this year, I believe. But the cost of living in cities like LA and New York has exploded recently. I live in LA, but the assistant salaries barely moved. I think in the last 20, however many years. I think it's wild to me that many major agencies and companies are still paying that. I think it was just below $45,000 in 2025. It's not sustainable, right? Post-tax, that's take off 10K or it's 9 or 10K, 36K a year. That breaks down to roughly 3,000 per month. Just doing like mental math here, but rent alone's half of that. People have college debt. And I think it's creating a serious barrier for talented people who necessarily don't come from wealth or have families in the industry. But I will say, that's always been the case with entertainment. But rent 20 years ago in LA, I did a little research for this study, was about $900 per a one bedroom. It's over $2,000 now. So it's ballooned. And I don't think you can tell me that those assistant wages have doubled in the past 20 years as well. So I think that's where the issue is, right? It's always been the entertainment industry has always had that barrier to entry because, low pay. And so I think people that come from, wealth or have families in the industry are able to, I think always it's Hollywood, right? That's always been the case. But I do think looking at it now, we're losing future leaders at these larger companies because that requires mostly in-person, structure before they even get a shot. But I will say with the rise of remote work, we're seeing more and more opportunities and pathways for those same people to succeed. So I think it's a double-edged sword. The traditional model is I wouldn't say breaking, but definitely, that there's tension there, but there's also way more opportunities now than there's ever been to enter our industry.
And, sticking with that thread line of the remote roles and people getting promoted into C-level, positions, the COVID-19 pandemic reshaped the workplace dynamics. Do you think the hybrid or remote roles will become more common in entertainment?
Yeah. I mean, 100%. I think there's not many like silver linings with the COVID pandemic, especially in our industry. So many people lost jobs and were out of work. But I do think if you had to find a silver lining, it was the rise of remote work. And I think someone would argue against that, in the more traditional model. But I've been on my own company, been able to make hires from places like I have employees in Michigan and Ohio, people who are brilliant, they're driven, that probably wouldn't have the opportunity to or means to like uproot their own lives just to get in the room in a place like LA or New York. So I think the flexibility in terms of that question is like it's opening doors for more people to enter our industry in a way that the old system never did or couldn't. So you are seeing fully remote companies thrive in the digital era. But I think on the flip side, there's definitely drawbacks to that too. Like my company's fully remote now. I have employees in LA, but I would say like it's harder now to network. It's harder to grow trust on a human level via email or even Zoom calls. My personal belief is that you can achieve more in person with say a 30-minute coffee or a chat than any email chain can provide. So I personally make it a priority and take 3 or 4 meetings in person a week. I know many wouldn't necessarily agree with that, especially, those who are fully remote and digital first. So I think there's benefits in terms of like access for people looking to break in entertainment that'll cause more and more companies to turn to hybrid and remote only roles to become more widespread. But that's becoming more widespread in all sectors, right? Not just entertainment for many of the reasons I laid out. So there's positives to it. I think it'll continue to expand in terms of these companies offering, the ability to be either high.
Yeah, it is interesting when you speak about that dynamic. The argument you often hear on the other side is that in-person work does breed social skills. It breeds, how to deal with people. This is not, as this is not an industry that can all be dealt with on Zoom and emails. It's not a business like that, especially when you get into the more executive levels. So yeah, it's interesting from that perspective. I want to ask you, Warner, you've talked about Gen Z being more vocal and less tolerant of some of the toxic norms of the past. Do you think this generation is finally positioned to force lasting change in Hollywood, or will they find ways to absorb that resistance without truly evolving past it?
Yeah. And again, I'm not part of the generation, but what I've seen in terms of speaking with them, I try to talk with, 2 or 3 college kids each week. I speak at different universities, and it's a way for me to connect with the next generation and understand what are the resources and tools. So it's allowed me to have a pretty unique viewpoint into, at the ground level of what they're looking for. And as you said, they're less tolerant of workplace conditions. So across the board, though, younger professionals, whether it be Gen Z or other, they are, increasingly intolerant of what generations before them have put up with. And I think it's certainly because of everything being on social and digital and voices being able to be, and stories being able to be told in a much widespread manner. And I think it's a reflection of a workforce that values well-being, mental health, transparency and a lot of things. I think the rise, as we talked about, in remote work and digital platforms have amplified these voices tenfold. So, it made it clear that traditional workplaces models may need to adapt. Many have, many won't. I think companies that are recognizing and addressing those concerns, though, are probably more likely to attract and retain some of the top talent. But on the flip side, even I couldn't imagine having been an assistant fully remote. I don't know, just because so much of my experience was, the value that I got out of it was being able to, grow my network, establish resources. I create identity for myself within my peers who I now, I know do business with. So I think there's again, going back to that double-edged sword, I think I do think that it's a very important thing for these things to be talked about. And that's what I built an entire platform on. It's evolved with things like prioritizing mental health, but I do think it's going to be interesting to see, how that generation navigates, as you said, with social skills as they continue to rise up the ranks within our industry, and how successful they're going to be able to be, once they get to the top in terms of leading others, especially if things go back in person at some of these companies.
Warner, with the advancement in AI tools for scheduling and script coverage and even deal making, do you foresee assistants roles being reshaped over the next few years?
That's interesting. I use AI a lot because I'm a solo. I ran this I ran this company solo for a couple of years. So I think relying on some of those tools that you've laid out, but I think AI, I guess in the terms of assistance, right? AI is giving assistants the ability to have their own assistant at the core of it, right? It's offloading a lot of these brain draining, like repetitive tasks, like scheduling or coverage, inbox management. And I think instead it's creating a sense of space for them to focus on some of the more strategic skill building work that I think will be valuable for their career versus, having to spend 80% of the day focusing on some of these tasks that are now, ability to be streamlined through, AI. So I think rather than replacing assistants though, which people talk a lot about, there's these AI assistants out there. I think AI has the potential to accelerate growth and make the role even more dynamic looking forward. So I think the smartest assistants will use it to level up and not necessarily use it to check out, of their day-to-day job.
Yeah, no, it's about balancing those factors. Let me ask you, in a perfect world, if you could just project here for a minute, if you could redesign the entry-level assistant pathway into entertainment from scratch, no legacy baggage or whatever, what advice would you have for those wanting a career in music or entertainment?
Yeah, it's in terms of like advice, I guess, entering the workforce, I think it's talk to as many people as you possibly can in all facets and sectors of the entertainment industry. I do think there's value in terms of entering the workforce. There still is going to be value at these traditional companies because of the foundation, the structure, the access that they do offer, when you are entering the workforce. So I think as more and more of these startups continue to pop up and develop, and, mine being one, I do think there is value in trying to, get a role at one of these companies that provide a great training program. Like I think WME for me, people still look at the agency training programs. I love hiring people that I remember the first couple weeks of being at WME, all we were doing was reading up like literature about the industry, like sitting down for hours a day and learning about the deal flows and the types of deals and touring. And I think this is music specific here, and I think so finding a company that gives you the largest access to a network of people on all sides of the industry, I think is still going to be a way to quickly rise up, create a name for yourself in the industry and build your Rolodex of individuals who I think will become your peers and then definitely down the line, clients or business partners, in the future. So it's a very hard topic because I think there's benefits on all sides of it. But I do think the one piece of advice, if it boils down to, is say yes to opportunity, right? That may scare you or that you may think you're not ready for if they come up, but also expand your network by prioritizing in-person stuff. Like I said this earlier in the interview, but there is nothing more in my mind beneficial to, growing your career, being successful than creating real human relationships and interactions, authentic relationships with people around you, whether it be, your networking, like up and down. So with people ahead of you, but I also think it's really important to network laterally. You can only really do that in person. You can only do so much on email. So I'm not here to redesign the structure of it. I think there's benefits all over the place, but I think you will find the most success by that human interaction, whether it be hitting a show or whatever it may be in person. I know I kind of went all over there, but I think there's a lot to be said about this topic and, hopefully different ways to navigate it.
Absolutely. No, it's a lot of great insight. Warner, throughout your life, have there been any books or films that you have found to be particularly inspiring, professionally speaking, that you could recommend to our audience?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, I've always been a big proponent of mental health resources being pretty vastly underserved in entertainment. So I think the first a documentary that struck me pretty recently was the I'm Tim. It's about Avicii on Netflix. I think it shined a light on that side of our industry. And, I think there's amazing companies that are doing some incredible things like Backline and others that are providing resources on the mental health. So I think that opened my eyes to, touring and I think started a lot of discourse and commentary with people in our industry. Book-wise, I was actually sent by someone at Backline, a book, Music Never Stops by Peter Shapiro, great promoter at SF, and gave a pretty interesting behind the scenes view into his career. I think he said he's booked 10,000 shows. It was inspiring. He's worked with the dead and and others. So I think that book to me was in terms of touring and music really rejuvenated my love for in-person. You know, I'm very involved in the festival world. So I was pretty inspired by his career.
Yeah, and I just wanted to comment, that documentary on Tim, which was Avish's career, that's an excellent documentary that really gives a first-hand look at, and it's a cautionary tale, sadly. I mean, this immensely talented guy, but the documentary I thought captured so well, you know, what happens when your life and your art and your work all get out of balance, you know, and he paid the ultimate price for that, just, you know, going. And the documentary, as you recall at the end, it doesn't really address it head on, but, you know, it's almost like you can see where all of that is elements within the business. But that,
it was touching. I think if you work in our industry, you know someone that's dealt with addiction, you know, someone's suicide and drug use. I think those things, it's a lot. We talked a lot about Gen Z. These are topics that, you know, they are talking about younger, I'll just call it younger generations, not Gen Z, but they're talking about more and more. And I was inspired and by that documentary, you know, especially to, you know, reach out to others and check in with people. I think it was emotional for sure. And as you said, he paid the ultimate price.
Yeah, without a doubt. Warner, how can people reach you? Is it through the website? Is it through socials? What's the best way to connect with you?
Yeah. So, you know, my Warner Bailey, if you're on the more professional side on LinkedIn, but Assistants vs. Agents is our, you know, Instagram account. You know, I still answer all the messages that come in. I think it allows me a touch point to individuals, but, you know, we'll be launching panels across the country this year, hyper focused on universities, colleges. We're launching some short form stuff. We're actually releasing a resource-driven book in the coming. So I think there's many more ways, I think, our industry. We're also releasing a podcast in June. So there's going to be many ways, I think, to hopefully connect with a larger breadth of people at all sides. But in the meantime, you know, LinkedIn, Instagram, whatever your preferred method is, reach out.
Warner, we want to thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. This has been a very, very interesting conversation on a topic that does not get a lot of conversation around it, and one that I think is really important in a larger conversation for many of the reasons that you've articulated. So thank you so much for doing it. We really, really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, well, I want to thank you both for you know, the time and giving me the platform today. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. Man, this is what disruption is all about.
Yeah,
okay.
I agree.
So many areas to unpack here with the conversation with Warner. You know, first of all, hats off to him for doing this. He has really tapped into something very, very real.
Right.
And, you know, more importantly, very transformative.
Right.
And disruptive toward where the business is at today. This whole thinking of, you know, well, this is the way it is, and this is the way it's always been, and this is the way you're going to do it, suddenly doesn't really seem to be working anymore. And he brought up a lot of very, very interesting points, which we've just heard. One of the most interesting to me was the whole fact of our assistants who, you know, are starting in this realm. Are they literally being forced out of the locations that they need to be living in?
Right.
New York, LA, you know, big cities, because they can't afford to live there anymore.
Right.
That's a very real thing in terms of how do you afford, you know, and now I know it's a lot easier to do that in New York, because in New York, you can, you know, there's public transportation and state-provided transportation with trains and things.
But still, the living expenses are astronomical.
Exactly, in the city, but yet you can do. But in California, in Los Angeles, for example, I mean, try living in, you know, 2-3 hours away.
Right. That's I mean, unless you're working a remote job, which a lot of these are not going to be remote.
Exactly.
Be in person.
And that was the other thing that I thought was so fascinating was, you know, he spoke about the pros and the cons of actual remote work, how it actually can work against you in an industry that requires, you know, you to be.
Which leads me to my next point, which is the comment of the value of human connection in music and entertainment. And I quote what he said, you know, there is nothing more in my mind, beneficial to growing your career than creating real human relationships and interactions, authentic relationships with people around you. I think you'll find the most success by that human interaction. You and I have talked about this on several episodes, and just you and I with each other, about how networking is so important. And, there's only so much you can do from a computer behind your screen.
Right.
You have to go and meet people in person, shake hands. Again, getting back to that whole thing, you're running for president. You got to shake hands, kiss those babies' cheeks. You're running for office, even as an assistant, because you're trying to grow your network. So even in that, it's a battle of attrition to know as many people as you can. And you can't do that behind a computer screen.
No, I absolutely agree with you. And this brings up a bigger point, Eric, to build on what you were just saying, which is so crucial. If this is a component, the whole element of not networking, of not going out and, meeting your peers on a consistent basis, meaning like if you're not a people person, this is going to become a very, very difficult path
in this era
for you to achieve any kind of growth or success. If you're somebody who's, you don't have that like outgoing kind of thing where you want to meet people, it's going to become very, very difficult for you if you're wanting to get into this in order to achieve any level of success. So that's a very important component, is that because now we're getting into, the type of person. And, and he talked about that as well, what people are and are not willing to accept anymore within the culture of music and entertainment today.
Hey, Insiders, thanks so much for tuning into this episode. We really appreciate it. To get show notes, links, and everything that was mentioned during this interview, head on over to our official website at mubutv.com/podcast/show notes. If you're enjoying the content and what we're doing here on the show, please subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts from. And don't forget to rate and review our show at iTunes. 5-star reviews are always welcome and help to ensure that our podcast stands out on the top-rated and new and noteworthy charts on iTunes and our space. You can also find us at social media at Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter X, all ending with the handle MUBUTV, which is spelled MUBUTV. Don't forget to catch our flagship show, the MUBUTV Music Business Insider video series, airing every week on YouTube at youtube.com/MUBUTV. This show was produced and created by Rich Ezra and Eric Knight. Theme music by Disciples of Babylon, and be sure to tune in next week for another episode of the MUBUTV Music Business Insider Podcast.